Hello, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 5 in our series on rape culture. Links to the previous parts are in the descriptions below, so be sure to check those out first. But if you're all caught up, let's just get right back into it. Last time, we talked a little bit about the history of hookup culture, how it is in many respects just the logical conclusion to serial monogamy that was so popular in the 20th century. And now it's really become the preferred coupling strategy among young men and women, or at least among many young men and women. But there is another aspect to it that we don't talk about very often. And to me, it is the most surprising thing about hookup culture. And that is that the more I read accounts from people who have been involved in it for a long time, the more I get the distinct impression that the people involved secretly hate it. Which is weird because, it's the modern version of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the whole point of that is that's supposed to be fun. Why else would you be doing that? But in reality, it seems to be one of those things that gets old really, really fast. And the more you participate in it, the faster that happens. At first it feels exciting, feels liberating, but eventually it seems to become almost a chore for the people involved. And there's a reason that Mick Jagger, he can't get no satisfaction, right? There are diminishing returns when it comes to this kind of behavior. But as bleak as it is, it seems to have gotten to the point where there are a whole lot of young people who they don't know what else to do. And they can't really find a way out of hookup culture. They don't have a viable alternative to it. So I want to talk about a couple of articles exploring hookup culture, kind of on the ground level there. And one of them is a Rolling Stone article from back in 2014. And I'll link to this in the description below. They did a series of profiles on millennials in order to explore hookup culture and its variations. And one of those profiles was about a sorority sister named Christina. And by the way, this is by far the tamest of the profiles that they did. And Christina talks about having this naive dream when she first started college. Finding a college sweetheart, staying together forever. But then it wasn't too long before she became disillusioned with the idea of a relationship. After her experience with frat bros, as she puts it. And yeah, it sounds like they used her. And so in response to this disillusionment, she trained herself to act as much as possible like one of these same frat bros that disillusioned her in the first place. So now she describes herself and her friends as sexual vultures. And before circling carcasses, I guess, she pre-games with a water bottle full of vodka tonic before moving on to the rugby house, where the sporty, all-American type of guy that Christina favors should be in abundance. So she became disillusioned after being used by frat bros, so she decides to regularly go out and be used by frat bros to, I guess, change things up a little bit. So if you read the whole story here, there are really two faces to Christina's account of her life. And one is this kind of a manufactured moxie, like I'm strong, I'm liberated, I'm having a great time, and I am sticking it to those douchey frat bros who treated me so badly in the first place. That's a deliberate face. That's how she's presenting herself, and that's certainly how the author of the piece is presenting her as well. But you look at it, and there is a second face to her account as well, and it's basically despair. She's trying not to show it, but as soon as you start looking for it, it's blindingly obvious, like there's a giant neon sign pointing it out. So consider some of these things for a moment. She rebels against the douches who are just looking for someone to bang. She's rebelling against them by conforming to their expectations and just being someone to bang for them. And it's a short profile, but pursuing anyone other than douchey frat bros doesn't seem to occur to her. So that's one thing. Another, she has to get herself drunk before going to the parties. And a lot of people get this backwards. They generally think that people go and they get drunk, and then when their inhibitions are lowered, then they inadvertently do stupid things they never planned on doing in the first place. But it's very often exactly the opposite, and this certainly seems to be the case for Christina. A lot of times people are very determined to do something stupid. And so they deliberately get drunk because they can't bring themselves to do it otherwise. The alcohol is less of a snare, and it's really more of a performance-enhancing drug. And that's why she's getting drunk before going to the party. She's pre-gaming with the vodka before she even goes there. And she starts off with her dream of a boyfriend. And then later on she talks about how the very idea of having a boyfriend has become completely distasteful to her. She hates even the idea of dates. After having sex with a guy, she just describes it as, "we talked." And she certainly doesn't want to be tied down by any man. Quoting from the article here, "For her part, Christina isn't even nostalgic for a time when dating roamed the earth. She is adamant that hookup culture suits her just fine, and that she, for one, doesn't want a boyfriend right now. She says that while she certainly knows women who in theory do, she doesn't think many of her friends would prioritize a relationship over other life advancements. I was actually talking with my sorority about this. Like, if you had a promotion, but you had to move across the country away from your partner, would you stay with your partner or move? Most of us said we'd move. Having a guy hold you back, it's ridiculous." But at the same time, she says, "I'm obsessed with wedding crap. Like, I pin wedding stuff all the time. And I love Dave Cetera and Say Yes to the Dress. Like, I'm obsessed with the idea of getting married. But I want to skip the dating part and just know who I'm going to marry." So pause for a moment and just hold those two things next to each other and think about it for a minute. Hooking up suits me just fine. I don't need no man. I don't even want a boyfriend. I'm obsessed with wedding stuff and the idea of getting married. Quoting from the article again, she believes hookup culture might actually make this possible for her generation. "We'll be so experienced in all the people that we don't want. When we find the person who we do want, it's just going to happen." So yeah, she thinks, or at least she would like to think, she'd like to believe, that servicing 29 guys and counting is eventually going to lead to marriage. Why? Because of how little she wants any of those 29 guys. She is adamant that she loves banging random dudes that she straight up says she doesn't want. All while dreaming of marriage. And that's really sexual liberation in a nutshell. Literally drugging yourself up to service unwanted guys, hoping against hope that your empowered, no-strings sexual encounters will eventually lead to the strings that you actually wanted in the first place. This is not a woman who's having fun. Okay, this is a woman who's pretending that she's having fun, even to herself. And she's doing a pretty bad job of it. And the biggest irony of this is that the whole Rolling Stone piece is framing the entire set of profiles as this kind of, the kids are all right kind of message. You know, don't worry, you know, what they're going through, it may be a little different from what you're used to, a little different from how it was when you were a kid, but they're doing just fine. They're working it out, and there's no reason to think that anything could possibly be wrong with what they're experiencing. And there's one other article. Moving on from Christina, one other article I wanted to bring up. And this one was called Growing Up in Pornland. And this was, and again, I'll link to this one in the description as well. And this was a story that was precipitated by recent survey data about the influence of porn on the sexuality of teenage girls in Australia, ages 15 to 19. So it has a survey part of it, and there's also a lot of anecdotes from the author of the piece who works with a lot of young teens. And while the data and the anecdotes are all Australian, I don't think these results would be particularly weird in America. I don't think it's atypical here. And I kept seeing this being shared on Facebook for a long time after it was written by both my liberal friends and by my conservative friends, which is always quite interesting when they're both sharing the same thing. And in both cases, it says this kind of a call to action. And with good reason, because the article describes really, really bleak sexual landscape among teenagers. Here's a sample of some of the horrible stuff from this piece, and I'm redacting some of the language here. When asked, "How do you know a guy likes you?" a year 8 replied, "Well, he still wants to talk to you after you perform oral sex on him." Year 8 is ages 12 to 14, by the way. A 15-year-old told me she didn't enjoy sex at all, but that getting it out of the way quickly was the only way her boyfriend would settle down and watch a movie with her. I'm increasingly seeing year 7 girls who seek help on what to do about requests for naked images. This is ages 11 to 13, by the way. Being asked, "Send me a picture of your breasts," is an almost daily occurrence for many. How do I say no without hurting his feelings? And very, very interesting question there. Girls are tired of being pressured for images they don't want to send, but they seem resigned to how normal the practice has become. Boys use the images as a form of currency to swap and share, and use to humiliate girls publicly. So the point of the article is that pornography is drastically altering sexual expectations among young men and women. Among men, certainly, but primarily among women. And that's whether they consume porn as well, which is increasingly common, or simply because they're picking up the expectations from the men, which is the main thrust of the article. So what's going on here is that porn is really filling the vacuum that's been left by sexual morality and cultural norms. And this is my commentary, not the article. We'll get to the article's commentary later on. We've gotten rid of sexual morality. We've gotten rid of cultural norms. And we've replaced it with pornography, inadvertently. Because every young person who's ever lived has wondered, how is all this supposed to work? And in functional civilizations, these questions are answered by society, or at least generally answered by society. They have customs and rituals that will guide people towards marriage. They will have morals and ethics that describe what is and is not appropriate for people involved. And, there's always variations on those, but you always have those basic answers to those questions in a functional civilization. But we're not living in one of those anymore. We in the West, we've deliberately emptied both of those categories because we thought they were oppressive. And what we've ultimately done is forced kids to carve their own path through the wilderness, as it were, by deliberately robbing them of sexual morals and of cultural norms. And, at some point their church or their family might have told them, hey, you shouldn't have sex until you're married. But I've very rarely have parents in churches these days told them how to actually get there, actually get to marriage in a reasonable time frame. Because the median age for marriage in America these days is about 30, which is really old. That's really old for marriage, historically speaking. And so what we've ultimately done is we've demanded celibacy from our youth. We've demanded, oh no, you can't have absolutely, if you are supposed to wait for marriage before you have sex, we're basically saying no sex period until you're in your 30s, which is kind of nuts. That's celibacy. That's not chastity. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but suffice to say, celibacy never worked particularly well for when monasteries demanded it of their monks. When Rome demanded of their priests, there's a lot of licentious behavior in a lot of those places through history. It never works particularly well because not everybody has that gift. Not everybody has that level of self-control. Celibacy can work for a while, but for most people, celibacy does not work indefinitely. You can't just turn off your sexuality for such a long period of time. So the kids have to look for sexual norms elsewhere, not in cultural norms, not in sexual morality, not in anything that they're being taught by their church or their parents. So where are they going to look instead? Well, they are going to look wherever they can see sexuality in practice. And that's porn. That's where you see it directly in practice. And it's also the broader entertainment industry as well, which it is in most cases fundamentally pornographic when it comes to sexual relationships. You turn on the WB and it's certainly limited in how much nudity it's allowed to show or how graphic the sex is, but all of it is founded on being emotionally evocative to the exclusion of anything else. It's all about presenting visceral emotional triggers rather than crystallizing any deeper concepts than just that. And that is pornographic. It's the same reason we can say something is pornographically violent, because it's just there for the viscera, not for anything meaningful. And this is why, the relationships of virtually every TV character these days are in this constant flux. Stable relationships, they're not dramatic enough. And so, every other week there's always a new relationship, or there's a new breakup, or there's a new love triangle, or there's a new affair. And in all of these cases, and all these change up, it always involves the couple, being overcome with emotion and then having sex. And so that is what kids start looking for in their own relationships. That's how they want to relate to each other as well. So naturally, relationships are going to start looking more and more like popular porn. Or at least the people involved will be trying to make it look more and more like popular porn. And one of the most insidious things about pornography is just how easy it is. You can type in a few keys on your keyboard or on your phone and see whatever you want to see. And this growing expectation of instant gratification in our culture, it really isn't any different when it comes to sex. These days, it's find hookup, discard hookup when you're done. You want to get right to it right away. And these kind of facets of it this is really how hookup culture is creating rape culture. I said before they're basically the same thing. This is why. First and foremost, because of a growing sense of sexual entitlement. Because if the goal for your relationship is sex, well, then sex is an expected part of your relationships, and consent is the only hurdle that you need to clear to reach your goal. So if you start a relationship, and I'm using relation very broadly here. This can include just talking up your prospective one night stand. And starting any kind of relationship means that you're expecting sex with that person. And if you had a big heaping pile of impatience to the mix because of our instant gratification culture, well, then you're going to have a lot of aggression being taken. You're going to have a lot of liberties being taken. And there's going to be a lot of pressure from within that relationship, even these really short relationships, to get consent. And in a sexually amoral culture where consent is the only thing that matters, it's pretty hard to tell exactly where reasonable self-determination ends and coercion begins. Because there's really no basis that you can use to judge that if consent is the only thing you're allowed to consider. So sexual entitlement, that's one of the big issues here. Other big issue, ad hoc boundaries. Any kind of absolute or even cultural boundaries in sexual relationships have been deliberately torn down over the past few generations. It doesn't mean there are no boundaries. It just means that boundaries are usually made up by individuals on the spot, and boundaries like that just don't have a lot of force. Every boundary, it's no larger than the wholly personal decision, and it affects nobody except yourself and maybe the person that you're with. So, if those are the only kind of boundaries you have, not a lot of force to that. I mean, that basically amounts to New Year's resolutions. You have a good intention, you stick with it for a month, but by February, you're back doing what you were doing before the year began. So those kind of boundaries, we don't have them. We don't really have any effective boundaries for relationships anymore. Certainly not sexual boundaries at any rate. And lastly, the other thing the hookup culture really does is take away people's reasons to say no to hooking up, to having sex. Because if everything is okay as long as it's consensual, well then of course people are going to push for consent. And even if it's only yes means yes, or only an enthusiastic yes means yes, it's all going to be about manufacturing that yes. And it gets worse because consent has been so dehumanized, like we talked about before, there isn't any tangible reason left to say no. All you've got is this entirely arbitrary, well, I don't want to. That's the only legitimate reason left to say no to sex. And if you're hoping for a relationship with a person, as is fairly common with for exactly one person in quite a few hookups, well, it just comes off as mean. You're basically saying, I just don't want you to enjoy yourself. I'm not even sure why I don't want you to enjoy yourself. I just don't feel like it. And, I mean, there's conscience, sure, but we've all been taught growing up that our moral intuitions on the matter are a result of being brainwashed by religions and old-timey traditions, and they're just making us prudish. So you have people in situations where their consciences are screaming at them, but they actually think they have a moral obligation to ignore it. And that's why, in that Pornland piece, the girls talk about it being so difficult to say no to these fairly outrageous requests. And ironically, the Pornland piece itself reinforces that difficulty. Because you read that, and the key complaints that the author makes, at least the ones that are actually based on the data and the anecdotes, there are really only two of them. The first is that, well, girls aren't enjoying sex as much as the boys are. And again, enjoy is the author's word. I'm not editorializing there. So that's the first one. Girls aren't enjoying sex as much as the boys are. Second, well, girls have to trade physical intimacy to receive emotional intimacy. So those are the two complaints. But in the absence of sexual morality, what exactly is the problem with that? What's wrong with either of those things? I mean, girls aren't enjoying themselves enough. Oh no, what are we going to do about that? Generally, if it's just a matter of enjoyment and nothing else, people are generally responsible for their own enjoyment. And as far as the trading physical intimacy for emotional intimacy, every relationship involves trade-offs. Hey, I'll watch The Notebook with you if you watch Deadpool with me. Normal relationship thing. And apart from sexual morality, why is trading sex for a date any different? What exactly is the problem there? It's just people learning to work together, learning to compromise, learning to negotiate a relationship. And that's all you have left when consent is the entire basis of your sexual morality. And especially dehumanized consent. Because if these girls want to say no, the only ground they have to stand on is their own whims. And we all recognize that there's a deep dishonesty in our culture's message of, your whims are more important than anyone or anything else in the world. We all know that that's crap. And the people involved in this know that's crap too, but they don't have anything else. And what all of this adds up to is a lot of people having a whole lot of sexual encounters that they really didn't want in the first place. And you know what? Maybe they said no. Maybe they didn't say no. Maybe they affirmatively consented. Maybe they didn't affirmatively consent. And you know what? Very often, people in these situations, they're not even sure whether their own answer is yes or no. And they end up acting some combination of yes and no. And that is legitimately confusing for people. But what isn't confusing, what is very clear in this situation, is that people are not particularly happy with this new arrangement. And that's where we're going to pause for now. So please like, comment, share the video, subscribe, and join us next time for the conclusion, where we are going to consider, how do we fix this?